She stood in the doorway of the house I'd just inherited, dressed like she was attending a board meeting, and told me with a smile so polished it could cut glass that she'd be taking the master bedroom. I could have the space above the garage. She actually said that. To me, in my house. And the worst part, my own son was standing right behind her, nodding. I need you to stay with me until the end of this story. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I understood about family, about forgiveness, and about what it means to finally stop running. My name is Gerald Pruitt, and for 8 years I lived in a studio apartment on the east side of Houston, the kind of place where the window unit rattles all night and the neighbors argue in 3 different languages through walls thin as paper. I worked odd jobs, maintenance mostly. Some nights security shifts at a warehouse off the ship channel. I ate canned soup more than I'd like to admit. I was 63 years old and I was surviving, which is not the same thing as living, not even close. This is the part where I have to back up, because none of that makes sense without the 8 years before it. I'd spent 26 years working for a mid-size commercial construction firm out of Katy. Project supervisor. Good salary. I owned a house in Cyprus, a 4-bedroom with a covered patio and a backyard. I'd landscaped myself over 2 summers. I wasn't rich, but I was solid. I was the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late, and believed, genuinely believed, that if you worked hard and stayed honest, the ground beneath you would hold. Then the recession hit, and it didn't. The layoffs came fast, the way these things always do when companies are terrified. First rumors, then silence, then the envelope on your desk with HR's phone number on the back. I was 54, old enough that the industry saw me as expensive, young enough that I didn't qualify for anything. I burned through my savings in 8 months. The house went into foreclosure. And then I drove 40 minutes across Houston to my son Darnell's neighborhood, Pearland, the kind of suburb where every lawn looks the same and every driveway holds a car that costs more than my first house, and I knocked on his door. I remember standing on that porch, holding a paper bag with 2 changes of clothes in it. That's what I'd packed. 2 changes of clothes, because I was telling myself it was temporary. Darnell opened the door. He was 33 then. Successful. His wife Renata had made sure of that. She'd managed every dollar, every social connection, every dinner party invitation since the day they got married. She appeared behind him almost immediately, arms folded, and I knew from the look on her face that the answer was already decided before I'd opened my mouth. "Dad," Darnell said, and his voice carried that particular tone men use when they're trying not to sound like they're apologizing. "This is really hard for us right now." Hard for them. I just lost everything. And it was hard for them. Renata stepped forward. She was always the one who stepped forward. She had this way of speaking that made cruelty sound like common sense, slow, patient, reasonable, as if she were explaining something to someone who just wasn't quite smart enough to understand. She talked about their mortgage, their children's futures, their retirement accounts. She talked about risk and responsibility. She talked about everything except the $18,000 I'd given them for their down payment, or the 6 weekends I'd spent building the deck where they hosted their summer parties, or the 2 years I'd driven across town every Thursday to watch their kids so Renata could go back to work. None of that came up. What did come up was a motel. There was one on Highway 288, she said. Reasonable weekly rates. Clean rooms. If you have ever been told by someone you love that you are a problem they don't want, you know what that moment does to a person. It doesn't just hurt. It restructures something. It changes the way you see yourself when you look in the mirror, the way you answer when someone asks how you're doing. I drove to that motel and I checked in and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought, I must have been wrong about everything, about who I was, about what I meant to these people, about what family was supposed to be. 8 years, I thought that. 8 years is a long time to believe you're the mistake. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning last February, my phone rang at 7:45. It was a lawyer. His name was Theodore Marsh, and he worked out of a firm on Post Oak, one of those old Houston addresses that tells you immediately the person on the other end of the line is serious. He told me my brother Calvin had died, heart attack, alone in his study at his property outside of Brenham, about 90 minutes northwest of the city. I sat down on my kitchen chair, a folding chair I'd bought at a church sale, and I pressed my hand flat against the table to keep myself steady. Calvin. My quiet, meticulous, deeply private brother, who'd sent me a card every Christmas, and never once asked what went wrong between me and Darnell, who'd driven to my studio apartment 3 years ago with a bag of groceries and never mentioned it again. Calvin, who was the only person in my family who'd never looked at me like I was something that needed to be cleaned up. Mr. Marsh told me I was the sole beneficiary of Calvin's estate, 280 acres outside of Brenham, main house, multiple outbuildings, fully operational cattle and hay operation. I laughed. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because my body didn't know what else to do with information that large. I won't lie to you, it took me 3 weeks to even drive out there. 3 weeks of paperwork and sleepless nights and the terrifying suspicion that all of this was somehow a mistake that would unravel the moment I showed up to claim it. But I drove out one morning in early March, through the hill country edge where Houston finally exhales into open sky, and I found Calvin's place, and it was real. Rolling land, an old stone house with a deep porch, pecan trees older than anyone I'd ever known, a barn that still smelled like work. I'd been there exactly 5 days when I heard the cars. 2 of them. A black SUV and a champagne-colored sedan. Pulling into the gravel drive, kicking up caliche dust. I set down my coffee and watched through the kitchen window as Darnell climbed out, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt on a Tuesday morning at a cattle ranch, looking like he'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a corporate retreat. Renata emerged from the passenger side, blonde hair perfect, carrying a large bag, already surveying the property with the focused attention of someone calculating square footage. Their daughters Imani, 17, and Jade, 15, climbed out of the back seat looking bored and vaguely hostile. My granddaughters, strangers. I hadn't spoken to any of them in 8 years. I opened the front door before they could knock, and I stood on the porch and waited. Darnell had the grace to look uncomfortable. Renata did not. "Gerald," she said, using my first name the way she always did, a small, deliberate signal that she didn't consider me family enough to call me Dad. We were so devastated to hear about Calvin. We would have been at the service, but we only found out afterward. That was a lie. Calvin's obituary ran in 2 Houston papers. Renata read obituaries the way other people read box scores. "What do you want?" I said. Darnell shifted his weight. "Dad, we're family. We should be here for each other in a time like this. Where were you 8 years ago?" Renata's smile didn't waver. It never wavered. That was the thing about her. She'd built herself into a person who didn't show the cracks until the cracks were too wide to hide. She talked about the property being too large for one person to manage. She talked about liability. She talked about my age, which she mentioned twice, in that sympathetic tone that made it sound like concern and meant something entirely different. And then she said it. She gestured toward the house and said they would take the upstairs master suite, and I could have the apartment above the garage. "Private entrance," she said. "Very comfortable. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I want you to really feel the architecture of that sentence." This woman, who had turned her husband against his own father and sent him to a highway motel 8 years ago, was now standing in the house I'd inherited and telling me where I would sleep in it. Not asking. Telling. I looked at Darnell. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That told me everything. "Leave," I said. "All of you. Now." Renata's expression shifted just slightly, just enough. "Gerald, I think you're being reactive. This is a large property, and the taxes alone." I said leave. They left. But as the SUV reached the end of the drive, it stopped. Darnell got out alone. He walked back up to the porch with his hands in his pockets, and he looked like someone who just realized the person he'd been following had led him off a cliff. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. About today. About 8 years ago. Sandra Renata, she found out about Calvin from a cousin. She's been talking about this for weeks. I should have stopped it. I didn't. I looked at my son, and I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long car trips, who'd cried when our old dog died and made me promise we'd get another one, who'd been so excited to show me his first apartment that he'd driven me around Houston for 2 hours, pointing out every neighborhood landmark like a tour guide. That boy was in there somewhere. I could see him around the edges. Some things can't be undone, Darnell. I know." He walked back to the car and drove away. And I stood there in the quiet of Calvin's land and thought, this is not over. I was right. I found the first letter 2 days later, tucked inside Calvin's roll-top desk beneath a stack of cattle insurance documents. Calvin's handwriting careful, angular, always slightly too small, like he was rationing ink. "Gerald, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've inherited more than property. You've inherited a problem I've been watching build for years. I love you." That's why I planned ahead. My hands were shaking by the time I finished the first page. Calvin had hired an investigator, had been gathering information for nearly 2 years. He'd anticipated with the calm, methodical clarity that had always been his defining quality exactly what would happen the moment Darnell and Renata discovered the inheritance existed. The second letter was in the barn, hidden inside a coffee tin on the highest shelf, behind a row of fence staples. Finding it felt like following a map my brother had drawn specifically for me. This letter was longer. It contained financial records. Darnell and Renata's life was a performance built entirely on borrowed money. Their house in Pearland was mortgaged 3 times over. Darnell's landscaping business he'd pivoted from his previous sales career was losing money on paper while Renata kept the social calendar full. Credit card debt north of $50,000. 3 personal loans. A second mortgage taken out 18 months ago. They were drowning. And I was the life raft. The third letter was in a safety deposit box at a bank in Brenham, whose key was in an envelope the lawyer gave me, along with the deed. Inside the box was a document that changed everything, an amendment to Calvin's will, filed separately, with specific inheritance conditions attached. I could not subdivide or sell the property for 5 years. I had to maintain primary residence in the main house. No family member could establish residence on the property without triggering a reversion clause that would transfer the entire estate to a land conservation foundation. Calvin had made it legally impossible for them to move in, and he'd made it impossible for me to be pressured into selling and splitting the money. And he'd funded a separate trust to cover property taxes and operating expenses for a decade. My brother had loved me in the most practical, effective way he knew how, by protecting me from the people who would exploit the love I still carried for them. They came back on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks later. This time Renata brought reinforcements, her parents, her older sister, and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be a paralegal. They arranged themselves on the drive like a delegation. Renata was wearing black, mourning clothes, the performance of grief she hadn't bothered with at the actual memorial. She knocked. I opened the door. She said they needed to talk as a family. Her father stepped forward, chest out. He started talking about my age again, about liability, about what it meant to manage a property of this size alone. Her mother was taking photographs of the house and outbuildings, and when I asked why, she said it was for an insurance assessment. An assessment nobody had asked her to conduct on property she had no relationship to. Renata explained that they'd consulted attorneys, that there were grounds to contest Calvin's will, that a court might determine a man of my age and limited income history wasn't a suitable sole administrator of an estate this significant. Her voice was gentle the entire time. She made it sound like concern. I looked at Darnell. He was standing slightly behind his wife, his face a careful blank. He wasn't saying anything. He was just letting it happen. Again. That's when I remembered the last envelope. The one Calvin had marked, "Open only if they come back." "Excuse me," I said. "I need to get something." I found it where I'd put it, in the barn on the high shelf. Calvin's final letter was brief. It said, "Show them the photographs if they're threatening you financially. Show them the bank statements. Show them the recording. You have everything you need. Use it." Inside the envelope was the investigator's full report. Photographs, financial records, and a small digital recorder. I walked back to the porch holding the folder. Renata was mid-sentence explaining how they could convert the barn into separate living quarters, how it would actually increase the property's value when I interrupted her. "Renata," I said, "how much do you have left in your personal checking account right now?" The porch went quiet, truly quiet. Even the birds seemed to stop. I didn't wait for her answer. I opened the folder and I laid it out, piece by piece, the way Calvin had organized it. The bank statements, the credit card records, the photographs Renata at an upscale restaurant in the Galleria 2 weeks after Darnell had told her they needed to cut expenses, the receipt visible in the investigator's shot. Renata at a luxury spa in the Heights. Renata at a furniture showroom in Rice Village. A purchase that cost more than my monthly rent in the studio apartment where I'd lived for 8 years because her husband told me they couldn't afford to help. Darnell's face went from blank to pale. "Renata," he said slowly, "you told me that account was frozen. I can explain, but I had one more thing to show them." I pressed play on the recorder. Renata's voice filled the morning air, clear as water. She was talking to someone, a friend. The investigator had noted at a coffee shop in Montrose, talking about me. talking about how I was probably going to need someone to manage my finances soon, talking about how the ranch was probably worth a couple million and how you could subdivide the back 40 acres alone and sell them off and cover all their debt and have money left over, talking about how once we got things situated, we'd have real leverage. Renata's mother stopped taking photographs. Her father closed the folder he'd brought and didn't open it again. Her sister found something important to look at somewhere in the middle distance. And Darnell stood there listening to his wife's voice explain exactly what kind of family he'd been protecting for 8 years. The silence after the recording ended was the longest silence I have ever stood inside. And I have had a lot of practice with silence. Renata started to speak. Darnell stopped her. "Get in the car," he said. Darnell. Renata. Get in the car. They drove away in separate directions. I sat on the porch for a long time after that. And I want to be honest with you, I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. The kind of tired that lives in your bones and doesn't lift after sleep. Because I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't wanted to be right about what they were. I had wanted, 8 years ago and still today, a son who would have just shown up without a plan. But I had what I had. And what I had was my brother's land and my brother's foresight and, for the first time in a long time, solid ground under my feet. Darnell called me 3 days later. He called from a number I didn't recognize, a friend's phone, it turned out, because Renata had taken both of theirs. She'd also taken the car and 40% of what was left in their savings. She'd filed for divorce the morning after the confrontation at the ranch, citing irreconcilable differences, which was, as far as I could tell, the first honest thing she'd said in years. He asked if he could come out to the ranch, alone, just to talk. I said yes. He arrived looking like a man who'd been awake for 72 hours, which was probably accurate. He sat on the porch and we talked, really talked for the first time since he was a young man. He told me things about the last 8 years that I'd suspected and things I hadn't known at all. He told me that Renata had framed my unemployment as irresponsibility, my layoff as character failure, until he'd started to believe it himself, because believing it was easier than carrying what he'd done. He told me that he'd known, somewhere underneath everything, that she'd been spending beyond what they had. But asking about money meant a fight, and Renata's fights were exhausting in the specific way that leaves you feeling like the unreasonable one. I asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted a chance to prove he'd changed. I thought for a long time before I answered. If you have ever had to decide whether to open a door for someone who once closed one in your face, you know how complicated that math is. Part of you wants to say yes immediately, because you've been alone long enough that the loneliness has a weight you carry everywhere. Part of you knows that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Part of you is just tired of calculating everything. I told him I couldn't let him stay at the ranch. The inheritance conditions were real and I was not going to risk the only security I'd ever had for a hope. But I told him about a man named Bill Wachowski, a rancher 3 miles north, whose youngest son had moved to Denver and left a small house on the property empty. Bill was looking for someone to maintain the place in exchange for rent. I told Darnell he could have the phone number. The rest was up to him. I also told him this: come back to me when you've done something, not when you need something. He nodded. He left. And for a long time I didn't know which version of my son was going to show up when he called next. The version that showed up was a better one. He called 8 months later. He was working 2 jobs, one at Wachowski's ranch, one at a feed supply warehouse in Brenham. He was paying down debt, attending a support group for divorced fathers, learning how to cook. He talked about his daughters, who were living with Renata in Dallas, who he saw every other month. He talked about the loneliness of starting over in your 40s. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just telling me how it was going. I listened, and I started letting myself hope again, carefully, the way you carry something fragile. It was during one of those calls that he mentioned the North Pasture. He'd been helping Wachowski move cattle along the property line, and he'd noticed a structure I hadn't found yet. A stone building tucked into a valley past a grove of post oaks, far enough from the main house that I'd never thought to walk out that way. The next morning I drove the truck as far as the road went, and walked the rest of the way. And there, in a shallow valley where the land curved like a held breath, was a small stone cottage, limestone walls, metal roof, deep shade from oak trees that had been there longer than any of us. A covered porch with a view across the hills that made something in my chest go quiet. Inside, there was a fireplace, a sleeping loft, a kitchen corner, and bookshelves lined with ranching manuals and poetry collections, and a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius. And on the table, an envelope. Gerald. Calvin had owned this land separately. Different deed, different inheritance conditions, different rules, no restrictions. Mine completely, to do with as I chose. And inside the folder behind the books was something else. Architectural drawings, contractor estimates, permit applications. A vision Calvin had been developing for years. A retreat center. Small cabins scattered across the 50 acres. A common building. Walking trails. A program for men who had lost their footing, men who'd been laid off or divorced or pushed out by families who decided they were inconvenient. Men who needed time and honest work, and people around them who understood what the floor feels like. He'd left a separate trust to fund the construction. And a note that said, "You know what these men need, because you were one of them." I sat in that cottage until the sun moved all the way across the sky. And then I called Darnell. I told him what I'd found. I told him about Calvin's vision. And I told him that I needed a project manager, someone who understood what it meant to rebuild from nothing, who could speak to the men who would come here with credibility, because he'd lived it. Not as a favor, not as charity. As a business partner, with real equity and real responsibility, the kind you can't walk away from without consequences. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When do we start?" I told him to finish what he'd already started. Stay at Wachowski's. Keep the warehouse job. Show me that he could complete a commitment before taking on another one. The permits would take 6 months. Construction would take a year after that. Come to me at the end of that time with something to show. He did. The Pruitt House, that's what we named it. For Calvin, not for us, opened 14 months later. 6 small cabins, a workshop building, a common room where we ate together every evening and talked about whatever needed to be said. We partnered with a counselor from Brenham who specialized in men's mental health. We connected with local businesses for job placement. We built something strict but fair. Residents could stay up to a year, but they had to work, had to participate, had to be building towards something real. I won't romanticize it. Some men came and left without changing. Some weren't ready. But the ones who were ready, those men rebuilt their lives in ways that made me believe again in the capacity of people to surprise you. Darnell managed the construction phase and then took over day-to-day operations. He was good at it. Better than I'd expected, and I'd started expecting more from him. He had a way with the men who arrived broken. He didn't offer them pity. He offered them work, which is what most of them actually needed. He'd learned that himself. His younger daughter Jade still had little to say to either of us. That was Renata's influence, deep and patient as a root system. And it would take time we might or might not have. But Imani, his older one, nearly 19, now drove down from Dallas one weekend and spent 3 days at the Pruitt House, helping in the workshop and eating dinner with the residents and asking questions with the directness of someone who'd decided to form her own opinions about things. On her last evening, she sat with me on the cottage porch and said, "Mom always talked about you like you were selfish. But these men aren't selfish. They just got hit hard and needed somewhere soft to land." I said, "Your mother told the story that made sense to her at the time. The best we can do is decide what story we're going to tell." She thought about that. Then she said, "Grandpa?" And that word I told myself I might never hear landed in me like something coming home. "Yeah? Can I come back in the summer? I think I want to learn how to run a place like this. Here's what I've learned from all of this, and I want to say it plainly because I think it matters. The people who hurt us most are usually operating from fear, not evil. Renata wasn't a villain out of a movie. She was a terrified woman watching her carefully constructed life fall apart, and she made choices she was able to convince herself were practical. That doesn't excuse anything she did, but understanding it makes it possible to let it stop defining me. The mistake I almost made, and I want you to sit with this, is confusing forgiveness with invitation. Forgiving Darnell did not mean he had to live in my house. It meant I was willing to watch and see who he chose to become. There's a difference between opening a door and handing someone the keys. What would I ask you to do today? Just this. Think about one relationship in your life where you've been waiting for an apology before you could move on. Ask yourself whether the moving on is actually contingent on the apology, or whether you've been giving someone else control over your own peace. Sit with that. Now I want to hear from you. Type 1 the comments if you think I made the right call, keeping Darnell at a distance until he proved himself. Type 2 if you think I should have helped him sooner, that blood should count for something even when it's been spilled. Type 3 if you've been in a situation like this yourself, and you know exactly what those years of silence cost. And tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is there. I think about that, the idea that this story is reaching people in the morning in Lagos and the evening in Manila and the middle of the night in Houston, people who've been turned away by someone they loved, people who are still waiting for the call that changes things. If that's you, I want you to know, you are not the mistake. You were never the mistake. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more stories here, and every single one of them is about the same thing, what it means to be human, and to keep going anyway. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.